Good morning, friends. I'm so glad you decided to join me to get your day started with a biblical perspective here on A Moment with Hales. If you're listening on Spotify, Podbean, or Apple, I did do a YouTube video if you want to hop over and watch us on YouTube today. We're going to be continuing with our practical Bible study series, where I hope to help provide you with some tools that will equip you as you're studying the Bible and also help you grow in your spiritual maturity. So last week we finished the literary genre of biblical narratives, and today we're jumping into poetry. Now, poetry is not my favorite, and honestly, I have a hard time with just modern poetry, let alone ancient Hebrew poetry. I think one of the reasons why I don't love biblical poetry, or maybe poetry in general, is it makes you slow down. So as you're reading through scripture, I like check things off my list. I'm reading through the Bible in 1 year. I want to go through and get my things done. But reading through from the poetic styles and pointing out the different poetic devices that are used, all the different metaphors and illustrations, help you really delve into a deeper understanding of what you're reading, kind of in a different perspective and in a different way. It's actually a really cool way to read scripture and look at scripture, but it's just a little more time consuming. It really forces you to sit down and kind of marinate and wrestle with the scripture and look at overall small biblical poetry, but then also kind of a larger scale of biblical poetry that we see themes all throughout scripture. So let's start with reviewing a little bit of the homework assignment, specifically Psalm 42. So Psalm 42 is a lament poem. It's a poem that's going through sorrow. It's someone who is really desiring and seeking the Lord, but cannot find him, but is also reflecting on times of joyous worship and remembering kind of the past, how the Lord came through for them. So in Psalm 42:3, the psalmist writes this about crying through the night. My tears have been my food night and day. So instead of just using a straightforward way to say I cried all day and all night, or I was weeping all day and all night, it's a little bit more creative. It deepens the meaning kind of with a different perspective and imagery. And then we have Psalm 42:7. Instead of saying I'm overwhelmed with my sorrow, the psalmist puts it like this: deep calls to deep sounds of your waterfalls. All your breakers and waves have rolled over me. The psalmist is using the waves and the waterfalls to represent the deep sorrow and grief that are just overcoming them while they're in the chaotic waters. So that gives you kind of two different examples that are sad examples, but it gives you examples of how poetry can give you a different perspective or deepen your meaning using illustrations and different ideas. Now, when we're looking at biblical poetry, it's structured in very specific ways. So in poetry, we're kind of used to having a rhythm or a rhyme, like we say roses are red, violets are blue. It has the same beat to it, the rhythm to it, and it also rhymes. Well, in ancient biblical poetry, we have poems written in something called free verse, and basically they're written in a structural format in couplets. So with the couplets, it's these two lines that give one idea, and then the second line kind of supports that first idea in a more verbally artful way, is the best way I can describe it. And these couplets, and we'll look at a few of them, but these couplets have different purposes. So you have one line and then you have another line underneath it that supports that original thought. That second line can either complete the thought, it can deepen the thought through imagery, or it can contrast the original thought. So let's look at another example in Psalm 42. Here's the couplet: as a deer pants for the water brooks, my soul pants for you. Okay, so the psalmist opens with the imagery of a deer panting for water. They're seeking something out. And then the second line supports that thought, but also gives a straightforward answer to the more artful idea of the deer panting for the water. Another example we have is Psalm 28:3. It says, do not drag me away with the wicked and with those who work iniquity. And the second line, who speaks peace with their neighbors while evil is still in their hearts. So the first line talks about who are wicked and have iniquity. The second line gives the illustration of what the wickedness is. They have evil in their hearts. That supports the first thought, giving kind of illustration to what the wicked and the wickedness and the iniquity is. Now let's talk about contrasting couplets. So we have that in Psalm 28:4-5. So the first line says, repay them for their deeds and for their evil work. Repay them for what their hands have done and bring down on them what they deserve. So the first line is calling for divine justice from the Lord. Repay them for their evil work. The second contrasting but also supporting line says, because they have no regard for the deeds of the Lord and the work of his hands, he will tear them down and never build them up. again. So we have a complete thought on what the divine justice should be on that second line supporting the first line, but then we also have the contrast where they didn't appreciate what the Lord built with his hands, so the Lord should in contrast tear down what they built with their own hands and never let it be built again. So that's a contrasting idea here. So when we hear poem or poetry in the Bible, where do our minds usually go? I'm going to argue we go to the book of Psalm or maybe Song of Solomon. We think of those books as kind of the poetic books of the Bible. However, 30% of the Bible is written in biblical poetry, and we find these poems in the biblical narrative stories. So sometimes you'll be reading through a story and it breaks and has some sort of poem of celebration or maybe lamenting within that individual story. And we have an example in Exodus. After Yahweh had parted the Red Sea, we have the full narrative story. Then we have the story retold, but in a poetic form. So let's read some of the couplets from that event. In Exodus 15:7, it says, "Your right hand, O Lord, is majesty and power. Your right hand, O Lord, shatters the enemy." The second line uses imagery to display God's majestic power. Continuing, "And in your greatness of your excellence, you overthrow those who rise against you. You send forth your burning anger, and it consumes them like chaff." The second line here uses imagery to display God's excellence and greatness. These couplets complete thoughts, but they also deepen the overall idea of God's excellence and God's majesty and how he overthrows his enemies. And then in verse 8, we get into the parting of the Red Sea. "At the blast of your nostrils, the waters were piled up. The flowing waters stood like a heap. The deeps were congealed in the hearts of the sea." The couplets here draw out a deeper understanding and use imagery to bring new illustration and idea to how mighty it was that the waters were parted. Specifically saying the blast of your nostrils, the water was piled up. So that shows Yahweh's majesty and power over the water, but then also it was piled up. That kind of gives you a different illustration just than the seas were parted. Just as we talked about in narratives, how there's micro stories that go all throughout scripture that kind of create pillars onto the overarching idea of the overall story of scripture, we have the same idea in poetry. So we have all these small poems throughout scripture and these micro levels that lead out to overall biblical themes on larger levels. So we'll be talking about kind of large biblical poetic themes throughout scripture next week, but let's talk about one specifically that I think is seen all throughout scripture, the theme that God is faithful. So in Isaiah 55 verse 11 and 13, we see the couplets being used to describe God's faithfulness. He says, "So will my word which goes forth from my mouth, it will not return to me empty, without accomplishing what I desire and without succeeding in the matter for which I sent it." This couplet demonstrates that God's plan will happen. It is ordained. His words will be successful. They will set out to accomplish exactly what he said they will, because Yahweh is faithful. Then we have the passage continuing in Isaiah 15 verse 13. And I think I really like this line, these couplets. I think they're really cool. So it says, "Instead of the thorn bush, the cypress will come up, and instead of the nettle, the myrtle will come up. And it will be a memorial to the Lord, for an everlasting sign will not be cut off." I would argue these poetic lines hit every reason that you have a couplet. So first we have the contrast of the thorns that represent hardships and difficulty. Then we have the evergreen, which represents a sweet smell and also something that is green forever, that is faithfully green. So that represents God and his faithfulness. So we have contrasting ideas through plants or through imagery of plants, which is very cool. Then we have a contrast. So they are contrasting images. You have the thorn bush and you have the evergreen. One is difficult and hard to deal with. One is going to be a sweet smell and something beautiful. So we have contrast through the plants that have a deeper imagery. And then we have that the second line is completing the first line, showing that God is faithful. Okay, friends, so we have talked about biblical poetry and how it is structured today through couplets, and I want to go ahead and make this practical for us. So for the homework, we are going to be reading through poetry while we're going to be identifying the type of couplets that they are, but also how they support the macro theme found throughout the Bible of God's faithfulness. So you're going to reread two passages that I had you read last week, Lamentations 3:19 through 14, and then also Job 38, 1 through 11. And while you're reading those, I want you to identify the couplets that you find and then label the type of couplet that it is. Does it deepen the meaning through imagery? Is it a contrasting couplet? Or is it a couplet that just completes the thought? And then from there, I want you to identify couplets that give imagery to God's faithfulness in those specific passages. And then I also want you to consider, how does poetry give you a deeper understanding or a different meaning of God's faithfulness? How does it teach you about God's faithfulness in a different way? And then from there, pick your favorite psalm, or open up to one and read through it and identify couplets as you go through. Find one that deepens your understanding through imagery, find one that shows contrast, and find one that completes a thought. Really spend time just marinating on the passage, slow down, read through it, think about it, meditate on it, like poetry is created for us to do. And that's all I have for you today, friends. So we are going to be continuing on the biblical poetry route and kind of delving into that topic. I didn't know how interesting it could be when you know what you're looking for, what literary devices you're looking for through poetry. I hope it gives you some practical tools to put in your tool belt as you're studying scripture and growing in your spiritual maturity. Well, if you enjoyed today's episode, give it a like. I would really appreciate that. You're an encouragement to me. Every watch is an encouragement to me. Every comment's an encouragement to me. So I really do thank you guys. And I'm hoping to get out some more coffee and conspiracy stuff soon, so keep your eyes peeled for that. I might end up doing that on Friday instead of one of these episodes, but I will let you know when we get there. But thanks for watching, and I'll be talking to you soon.